Hello and welcome to this presentation on securing organization-specific logins with Azure AD and ArcGIS. My name is Gregory Ponto. I'm a cloud security engineer with the software security and privacy team. And this is one of the most common questions we get, so I'm excited to have a chance to present it to you at this Dev Summit. So getting right into it, let's take a look at our use cases. We start out with users signing into ArcGIS. You've got users managing passwords in ArcGIS. This is okay for a while. But as user demands grow, as the number of applications that you manage grow, this quickly becomes a management problem. And that takes us right into our first use case. Single sign-on to ArcGIS using Azure AD. And here what we're going to do is we're going to set up a connection using SAML between Azure AD and ArcGIS such that users within Azure AD can sign in to Azure AD and be delegated access to ArcGIS. This gets us out of the problem of managing credentials across all applications. It centralizes that management, allows you to create and delete users in Azure AD, and effectively grant and deny access to ArcGIS. Our second use case just goes to best practices. Azure AD and ArcGIS both make use of HTTPS, essentially envelope encryption over the wire, and this is powerful and necessary protection. But in the case of sign-in, we want to add a second layer of protection. And so by encrypting the assertion, which is the authentication mechanism that SAML offers, that allows us to sign into Azure AD and sign into ArcGIS, by encrypting not just the envelope, but the contents of the envelope, we protect it from tampering and other attacks. And lastly, we'd like to set this up so that we have groups in Azure AD that we add users to, and by virtue of doing that, those same users get added to groups in ArcGIS, granting access to content. The concept is essentially that I'm going to be able to add and remove users in Azure AD groups, and that's going to grant and deny access to content in ArcGIS. So enough talk, let's get right into it. So here we're going to show the process for setting up SAML logins against an identity provider. In our case, we're going to use Azure Active Directory. Everything that we're about to cover is fully described in the ArcGIS Online help. We'll include this link in the notes, but you can also just search for setup SAML logins at arcgis.com. And in here, not only do you have just sort of general guidance around how to set up SAML for ArcGIS Online, but you also have details on all manner of different identity providers and give you step-by-step instructions on how to set up each one of these. And lastly, we're going to pay careful attention to the best practices for SAML security. Specifically, we're going to ensure that our sign-ins are signed, so we can ensure the identity of the identity provider is valid. We want to make sure that any identity provider we use is using HTTPS. Most of them do now, but this is a really important consideration to protect the integrity and the security of the assertion that your identity provider provides you. And finally, we're going to encrypt that assertion. This is the information that the identity provider provides you, which signs you into ArcGIS Online. By encrypting that assertion, we protect it against tampering. So to get started, I'm signed in to my ArcGIS Online organization. Under Settings, Security, where I can modify the security configuration, specifically the SAML login. So I want to create a new SAML login configuration here. Azure AD is a single identity provider, so I'm going to go ahead and hit Next here. Any name you will choose is technically fine here for the name configuration. This is really just the label that the login button displays. I'm just going to call it Azure AD. In my case, I am going to choose to let users sign in automatically. The security implications of this setting vary depending on your identity provider, but with using Azure AD, I am forced to specifically define which users in Azure AD can log into my application. And so I'm already limiting the number of users that can access ArcGIS Online by way of Azure AD, given its default configuration. Older IDPs like ADFS 2.0 can provide broader or support a broader set of users, potentially all the users in your organization. And so in those cases, you may want to choose upon invitation from an administrator, but practically speaking, almost everybody that I work with chooses automatically. Again, with a modern identity provider, this is a perfectly safe setting. So this is kind of where I have to stop, because the next thing I need to do is get the metadata for my identity provider from Azure AD. Let's go ahead and do that. Now here I am over in Azure AD under Enterprise Applications. And here's where I would create the new application information for my configuration against ArcGIS Online. Here I'm going to click New Application. And you can do this using a manual application configuration. That will work. But the easiest way to do it is to search for ArcGIS and pick the ArcGIS Online or Enterprise connection information. It's really just a template that predefines the fields based on Esri's recommended configuration. Then I'm going to click Setup Single Sign-On. And the fields I was referring to under the SAML configuration are these. So it predefines these configuration fields for us if you pick the ArcGIS Online template from the Azure AD Enterprise Application Configuration. Otherwise, you'd have to define these manually. And these, again, are all covered in our help here. Right. So within a given identity provider configuration, if you don't have a pre-canned template, which it's very nice that Azure AD provides this, you would have to supply the related LDAP or Active Directory attribute associated with the SAML claim that we support. And we support name ID, given name, surname, email address, and group based on these LDAP attributes. So again, if you wanted to create the enterprise application configuration manually, you would have to just supply those values here. You can essentially modify this, and you can define whichever field in your Active Directory you want this to relate to. So like, it's totally fine. This is the one you want, is user principal name. It's actually what our documentation recommends. But you could map the name ID of a given user to something else if you wanted to. But user principal name is the one you typically want to use. It makes the most sense. It's a guaranteed unique identity value. You really want that value to be unique. That way, everybody that logs in absolutely is uniquely logged into their account. If you use something generic like zip code here, then the user would log in. Their username would effectively be a zip code, and that's not likely a unique value. So you could end up with crossovers with your logins. Not a good situation. So bottom line is, if you can, just use the default settings that are provided by Azure AD, and otherwise ensure that you map the name ID or name identifier attribute to the user principal name source attribute, which comes from Azure AD, LDAP, etc. So back to my SAML configuration. Now that I have at least set this up at a basic level, I have my federation metadata that I need to provide ArcGIS Online. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and put this right here. And I'm going to just go ahead and check all of these boxes. This goes to the best practices for SAML security. Admittedly, doing this on an existing configuration without pre-onboarding the encrypted assertion will temporarily break SAML logins until you get the encryption, the assertion encryption in place. We're going to do that all together, but I'll point out that specific step so that you can actually apply this to an existing configuration. Now let's open this up and kind of see what happened. So by supplying that federation metadata URL, which came from Azure Active Directory, we were able to digest all the login URL values, logout URL values that we need, the certificate that's provided by Azure Active Directory, which it signs its assertions with, and then with this certificate we can validate the authenticity of the source of those assertions. Just double checking, yep, all of our security settings are in place. And so the last thing I want to do is download the service provider metadata from ArcGIS Online because I need to provide that to Azure AD. So going over to Azure AD, it of course wants a metadata configuration file just like ArcGIS Online needs one, sort of a bi-directional trust here. I'm going to supply it with that federation metadata that I just downloaded from ArcGIS Online. And it was able to pull out almost every value we needed. It isn't able to discern the sign-in URL, so I'm just going to open this up and pull it right out of the metadata configuration file, and that's what this is that I've just opened up, our metadata configuration file. I'm just going to grab the sign-in value for ArcGIS Online and put it in right here. Depending on your identity provider, this may happen automatically, or you may have to supply some of these values manually. The keys to all of these details are inside the respective metadata files, either from ArcGIS Online or Azure AD. So now that that's set, you can see these values all populated nicely. Now in theory, I should be done, but there's actually a few other steps that I need to take, and this depends a little bit on your identity provider. But in the case of Azure AD, one of the more modern identity providers out there, it's not going to allow just anyone from your Azure AD to sign in to ArcGIS Online. You have to explicitly grant users from AD to this enterprise application to allow those users and only those users to sign into ArcGIS Online. And this kind of goes back to why I chose to let users sign in automatically in ArcGIS Online. That's this setting here, because again, the only users that are going to be able to sign in are users that are a member of this configuration here. So I'm going to add a user. Let's grab a test user, assign this. Okay, so now I've got one user in my enterprise application. Obviously, in your organization, you may add groups or many, many users. But this is how you're going to manage access to your ArcGIS Online. And the great thing is, by doing this, you can take advantage of existing investments in multi-factor authentication, potentially PKI configuration that you guys have in place, biometrics, and of course any policies that you define within your Active Directory or your security store, whatever that happens to be. You can inherit all of those policies via your identity provider. So really, I'm not signing into ArcGIS Online. I am signing into my identity provider. I am providing my identity provider any multi-factor authentication details. I am subject to its policies. I'm subject to its group configurations, and essentially it gives me governance against accounts in ArcGIS Online by way of my identity provider. So this is a very, very powerful feature here. So now let's go ahead and give this a test. So I'm going to go ahead and attempt to log in with the user account, the SAML test user that I had just configured here. I'm going to click this Azure AD button. Again, that's that label that we set when we first configured SAML logins. Notice it's going to redirect me over to Azure AD. Now what happened here is it attempted to automatically sign me in, but it refused to do so because the assertion was signed with a private key, which ArcGIS Online does not have the public key reference to. So it's just like apparently some random identity provider attempted to sign me in to this account. That's the perception ArcGIS Online has. This is the security that we put into the system that's kind of getting in our way, but it's intentional. So let's go ahead and fix this. So to address this very, very common problem, you're almost certainly going to see something like this in your own environment at some point. I'm going to go into the enterprise application configuration, into my SAML single sign-on configuration, and I'm going to download the base 64 encoded certificate from Azure AD. And let's just take a look at this file to see if it matches the This is the public key. So I want to see if this public key matches the configuration that is set within ArcGIS Online for my SAML logins. And usually what I do is I take a look at like the last 4 digits of the certificate just to kind of visually compare. So if I open this all the way up, I suspect these are different. And they do in fact look different. So if I paste this value in, yes, that's a completely different certificate. I'm going to save that. Now let's see if this fixes our issue. So I'm going to try to sign in with Azure AD again. Aha! This time I am signed in as my SAML test user. And it happens so fast and it's so smooth and easy that users generally might prefer this option over built-in users, because if they're signed in to your Active Directory, they may get automatically signed in just as I did. So it's going to be a very, very familiar experience to them to use SAML as opposed to built-in accounts within ArcGIS. So sign-ins are working, but we've not technically followed every one of our best practices. We are missing one. We haven't actually onboarded the encrypted assertion piece of this configuration. Now, in order to do that, what we're really going to try to do is we want to supply the identity provider, this is Azure Active Directory, with the public key that references the private key that ArcGIS Online uses to decrypt assertions. So what we want is Azure Active Directory to encrypt assertions using our private key, or ArcGIS Online's private key. So it'll have the public key to do that. It'll encrypt the assertion, and ArcGIS Online will effectively be able to decrypt it. So in order to do that, I have to provide Azure AD with the public key for ArcGIS Online's SAML signing certificate. That public key is contained within the service provider metadata, which can be had by downloading this file here. So, I'll download it again just for completion. Let's take a look at it. So I'm just going to open this up, and any text editor will do. Okay, and so what we're looking for here is the encryption certificate. In fact, I'm going to open this up in Internet Explorer. It's a little easier to understand that way. There we go. So same thing, it's just formatted. This is just prettified, basically. But we're looking for that encryption certificate, and we want the entire certificate. Now, this is the public key, so I don't mind displaying it. It's designed to be shared. That's the nature of it. What we want is we want Azure AD to have this public key and to encrypt its assertions with it. And ArcGIS Online, which of course has the private key, which we cannot display, we cannot extract, we cannot see that. It has the private key that matches this public key, and it can therefore decrypt the assertions that Azure AD encrypts. So what I have to do to actually make this work is I need to copy this into a text file. So I'm going to grab a new text file here. I'm just going to paste the string in directly. I'm going to save this as AGO encryption key, public key. The name is irrelevant, just so I know what I'm dealing with. And the way you can tell if we did that correctly, just open it up. Just double click on it. And if it opens and you can read the values out of it, then in this case, Windows, is able to process the string, because this is really just a text string, right? So take a look at it again, nothing fancy, right? It's just a text string. But this can be read as this. This is the actual representation of this cryptographic value. So I know this is a certificate that will work. So now I'm going to take all of this and add it to my token encryption settings within Azure AD. This setting is different. It's the same conceptual setting, but it manifests differently in various IDPs. Also, this feature, I believe last I checked, was a premium feature of Azure AD, so that's something you may run into. You may have to turn on a premium setting to enable this last encrypted assertion step. In any event, I'm going to click Import Certificate, and I'm going to provide it the certificate that I just extracted. And I'm going to go ahead and activate it. Now this setting does come with a little bit of administrative burden. We need to pay attention to the expiration date for these certificates. When they expire, authentication will not work anymore. ArcGIS Align periodically recreates these certificates and avails them to organizations through the Federation metadata setting and also on the ArcGIS Align blog. So just important step here, and a common source of support questions is not minding the expiration date for your certificates. So these do need to be maintained. And again, that maintenance process essentially involves re-importing the new certificate once that's available from the various service providers, in this case ArcGIS Online. Now that I've onboarded the encryption, the encrypted assertion piece of my SAML login configuration, my security configuration is complete, and my assertions are signed, they are encrypted, and so I can have assurance that the authentication piece of my SAML configuration is effectively safe. But let's sign out and just make sure that in fact work. All this configuration should be completely transparent to users. Unless of course it's broken, then they will not be able to sign in. So we're about to test that. And really, nothing should change from my perspective, but under the covers, there's a layer of encryption that is protecting the integrity of the assertion that actually logged me in here. So we've configured SAML sign-in for ArcGIS Align via Azure AD. We followed our security best practices, but there's still more configuration that we could explore if we want to. And one of the more common questions we get is there a way for me to define a group in Azure AD and have that membership be represented in ArcGIS Align? The answer is yes. We support a feature called SampleBased group membership. And what's going to happen here is when you sign in to ArcGIS Align and you provide your assertion, which happens again transparently, there's a lot of metadata involved in that assertion. And one of the things that is passed over is any groups that you're a member of. And so we can read that value as long as those properties, or the group membership information contains the property that identifies it. So it's any one of these values. And to do this in Azure AD, the way we would start is we'd go over to Users and Groups, simply create a group. Oops. Go back here. I'm at the wrong level. I need to go up to the actual AD, into Groups. And I kind of already created one, but I'll just go ahead and create another one here. I'll call this one ArcGIS SAML Users. Just a label. The name doesn't really matter. Of course, what matters is the members. So I'm going to assign that same user that I was logged in as to this group. And kind of going back to the attribute, the group attribute setting I had mentioned before, in the case of Azure AD, that is this object ID value. So I'm going to copy this object ID value, and then I'm going to go into group settings in my organization. I will create a new group. Doesn't have to have the same name. I am going to give it the same name just for the sake of kind of understanding, but it doesn't have to have the same name. Tags, this doesn't affect the functionality. What matters is that we set this setting here. Who can join this group? Members of an enterprise group. And I'm just going to put the object ID. That's the enterprise group name that comes across the SAML payload. So I'm going to put that there. I'm going to click Create Group. And you'll notice that there's the only member of this group is this user I'm signed in as right now. But if I sign in again as the SAML test user, then what should happen is this group should be populated with my user that I just signed in as, the SAML test user. So essentially it keeps the groups in sync between Azure AD and groups that we define in ArcGIS Online. So let me go ahead and sign out. And sign in again. The reason I have to re-sign in is because that payload, that assertion that represents my identity metadata is coming from the identity provider. So we do need at least one sign in and sign out operation in order to get that metadata back over to ArcGIS Online so it can read it and pull out the group value. And so now, if I refresh the screen, you can see that user was automatically added. There's my SAML test user, and now by virtue of being a member of this group, I can access any content that this group has access to. And so that's how we can maintain privilege against items in our ArcGIS Online organization. Just ensure that you've got a group in your Azure Active Directory or your IDP. Add any users that you want to be a member of that group. Grab the object ID for that group. Use it as the basis for the enterprise group setting within a given group in ArcGIS Online. And then add any content you want to this group. And then anyone that signs in will automatically be added and they'll have access to it. So just to recap what we've covered, we saw how to set up single sign-on to ArcGIS using Azure AD. We saw how to set up signed and encrypted assertions to protect not just the envelope that transmits our credentials, but also the contents of the envelope, so protecting them from various attacks, including tampering. And we showed how to set up a group in Azure AD that syncs to a group in ArcGIS so that I can add or remove users from that group in Azure AD and they gain or deny access to content in ArcGIS. And this concludes our demo on how to secure organization-specific logins with Azure AD and ArcGIS. Please take a moment to click on the survey link directly below the video. Your surveys help us improve our content, and I want to thank you again for listening.